Hello and welcome to the channel. The podcast you're about to listen to has been an idea we've had for quite a while. It is part of a series we're planning on releasing on various topics, both international and relevant to our local part of the world. For years, we rarely saw any media focused on a dialogue between a parent and a child on issues relating to both, and figure such an intergenerational conversation would be an interesting exchange to record. In this episode and following episodes, we discuss the Iran-Israel situation, which is especially relevant for us. In the future, we will present other topics that we often discuss, so stay tuned for those. Full disclosure, this is the first attempt any of us have made to perform a podcast or make YouTube videos. Enjoy, and we look forward to releasing more content in the future.
So, roughly translated, Yakinabut means there was and wasn't. Okay? This kind of term describes to me, in a nutshell, what is going on in Iran right now. I would have to say, at the core of this particular, what is the difference, is definitely, I would say, the religious component, which is that Iran is one of the few countries or nations on this planet that accepted Shia Islam. All people are united as equals. And that is a very important distinction also between, I would say, not only kind of like the public life versus, religious life, but also the difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. A lot of people think that the connection between Iran and Russia is a more recent thing, but that kind of connection goes back
Yeah.
a long way.
Yeah, Russia has always been interested in what's going on beyond the Caspian Sea.
Yes.
Yeah, that probably led to how, and I wanted to mention this earlier, how a lot of modern Iranians, they're not all 100% Shia. There's a huge percentage of other religions or just general secularism in the modern populace of the place. So I thought I would just start all of this, just by making our biases clear, I guess. Because it's always important to get into that when you start conversations like this, see where the people talking are coming from. Quite clearly, it would be the case that we're sympathetic to the Iranian people, I think, not the regime or really any of the regimes in the area, just based on our background, given that we have family, for example, there. Knowing what we know about the history, which of course we'll get into a little bit, just to give some context. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that we're just the most sympathetic towards the Persian people and their current frustrations with their regime, the Ayatollah regime, and also probably how the rest of the world is treating them. So yeah, that's at least on my part. What about you?
I'm going to start by saying that my attitude or my opinion towards this renewed round of back and forth, or this conflict between Israel and Iran, is in large part influenced, having grown up with a mother who is originally from the north of Iran in Rasht. And she was a child during the regime of the Shah, which I will get into kind of like the history of the various different dynasties a little bit. I will go into detail a little bit at a later point. But she was a child during the regime of the Shah, and she was an older teen and young adult building up to the revolution. And I have to mention here that right when the revolution was about to take off, which was in 78, 79, she left for Europe, for Austria. So she left Iran. And I would have to say to the large part, my attitude and my impressions of what is currently gone, maybe even possible, I want to say explanations, are due to having grown up with an individual that was very much steeped in the traditions and culture, what it means to be an Iranian, but also a believer. Here I have to mention though that my mom was not a Muslim. She belonged to another religious minority in
It does
Iran.
change things a bit, but you certainly came from a similar background as
Yes.
most of the people, I would
Yes.
say, from the era. Especially coming from like a more country side living, which
Working
was very,
class.
very poor,
Yes.
to the city, which
Yes.
was much more first class.
She was very much working class. Her mom and her dad, they were barely illiterate. I mean, literate. They were basically illiterate. My grandfather, he was part Persian and also Russian Jewish. And my grandmother was, or her mother, was also mainly Kurdish. Now that's a whole different story, and I'm not going to go into detail about this because both of them actually grew up themselves. So my grandparents themselves grew up in northern Iran.
Well, yeah, speaking for myself in this regard, I've not had a lot of contact with your side of the family. However,
but you were getting to know them
yeah,
a little bit.
little bit, yeah, for sure. But my point is that a lot of my exposure to Persian people has been through my friend groups, mainly online, where I've met and talked to a lot of fine young Persian people, and I feel like in that way probably got a good eye, or a good expression would be like an ear to the ground on what's going on.
Or like a bird's eye view.
Yeah, so what's going on among the younger generation who live there as well, right?
So this conversation is going to be
we bringing those perspectives. Yeah,
yes.
we're bringing these perspectives to consideration.
We've obviously done
yeah
some kind of research as well,
yeah.
but our own impressions and the way we are going to talk about this, and being that we are emphasizing of understanding the people of Iran, we want to bring to the table actually the voices. Now, obviously, we are not the voice of Iranians, because in my case, I'm half Iranian, and you are quarter Iranian, but we want to talk about this in the context of letting the culture speak for itself, and maybe also using the example of culture, which I then want to go more into detail why I'm actually focusing on this. Let it speak for itself to actually explain why this conflict is so alien to many individuals, especially to the people in the West.
Of course, yeah, especially for us in the West, we tend to subconsciously probably think that nations elsewhere act with the same heuristics that we do for geopolitics or for internal issues, but of course that's not true in the least. It's different for the Chinese, it's different for the Indians, it's different for every culture and creed on this planet. So yeah, absolutely, this is important in the current context because there are major decisions being made which very well could influence all of us, which of course we can also get into. So what I thought we could also continue with, we've already hinted at it a few times, was just a sort of a brief historical context for what's going on, because again, discussing this sort of blind spot, I guess you could say, a lot of the West has for the Middle East. I've often seen, just in casual conversation, the region being homogenized quite a bit in terms of religion, people, and so forth. And while it's certainly true, and this is something I'm going to get into, it's certainly true there's overarching similarities to a lot of the conflicts and to a lot of the causes of the unrest there. So important to distinguish the different factions because they are each distinct, and of course, those distinctions are why they're fighting right now.
That's right. The reason why I want to kind of like dive into the life, the early life of my mother's, is because I think her example is really good in describing what is actually going on, and actually also describing the Iranian psyche, sort of speak. When I was growing up, I have to say my mother was and still is a formidable storyteller. And there's a saying or term that a lot of Iranians are familiar with. Any story, whether it is a fairy tale or if somebody's just telling a story about something that occurred to them in an afternoon, it begins with yakibut, yakinabut. And roughly translated, because this is an issue that we're going to run into, because I think that there's also some translation issues, and that is, I would say, at the core of a lot of conflicts, not just between the Middle East and the West, but anywhere where there is complete different cultures at odds with each other. So, roughly translated, yakibut, yakinabut means there was and wasn't. Okay? So, this kind of term describes to me, in a nutshell, what is going on in Iran right now. And it also describes what sets Persian culture and its people apart from other cultures.
So let's get into that.
Okay.
Because, again, this is just sort of, this is more of an anecdotal observation on my part, but I've often observed people, and I joke about, we often joked about this with some Persians, where, folks often think they're just basically Arabs, essentially Arabs who live up on the plateau, which is highly insulting. To the Persians. So what are the major differences between, say, Iran and Persia more broadly, and the rest of the Arabic community, excluding, of course, for now, Israel, which only was more of a newcomer to the Middle East, at least as far as current situations go. But of course, they are a different culture than most of the Arabic communities around them. So, like, what would be some of the major differences that would illustrate my prior point, where there are major differences between these peoples that we homogenize, I think, way too much over here.
Aside from the obvious historical differences, which is culture, language, where they originally come from, I mean, there is obvious differences. But I think that at the core of this particular conflict right now, between, one could say, Iran and the West, I'm not going to focus just on Israel. I think this is just part and parcel of the whole conflict between the West and Iran. And I would have to say, at the core of this particular, what is the difference, is definitely, I would say, the religious component, which is that Iran is one of the few countries or nations on this planet that accepted Shia Islam. And I don't know if you, for instance, personally know about the difference between Sunni and Shia Islam. I'm by no means an expert, but I know a little bit about it, and it's very easy actually to research. But the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam is that after the death of Muhammad, the leadership was to be elected. Now, the way the Shias differ from the Sunnis is that the Shias had a different idea for the Imam, which was another family member of Muhammad, which was Ali. He was the first Imam. And after him, there was going to be more Imams. And also, Shia Islam also has the belief that when the 12th Imam comes around, which could be any moment, Some people were speculating that the first supreme leader of Iran, which established himself in 1979, which was Khomeini, was quote unquote the 12th Imam, but that's not the case.
Yeah, they're a bit messianistic. They think there's going to be some coming.
It's a good point that you're saying that, because like Christianity, Muslims, or in Islam, there's the belief that there is going to be some form of calamity or series of calamities that lead to the end of the current world. Very different how this is going to happen. Very different why this is happening than Christianity, but there are certain core commonalities that there is.
Yeah, and certainly true that for the Israelis' parts, they also have quite a few sort of doomsday-ish beliefs in their biblical structure, or sort of like individuals in that structure who believe these things. And it's interesting to me that so many of the interested factions in the Middle East have these ideas, and a lot could be said of how they view their actions as facilitating this end time. They're active participants in their religion, which is a dangerous mix, as the precedent for such things is usually not great.
Well, this is a really interesting kind of like segue into the reason why Shia Islam is to a large degree part and parcel not only of the leadership in Iran, which means politics,
they are a theocracy after all.
Yes, big example, like a perfect example of theocracy, but also why the people feel a certain allegiance. A lot of people might not know this, but Shia Islam was embraced and accepted in the 16th century in Iran. And this was the Safavid dynasty that accepted it. And at this time, there was a huge pushback against the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate.
The Turks.
That's right.
Who will be a recurring character, I'm sure, in this whole story.
Yes, even to the present day. But that is beside the point. So they were accepted in the 16th century and welcomed because at this time, the Persian dynasty had a lot of problem fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And Shia Islam was very much against the Ottoman Empire. We also have to bear in mind they are also Sunnis, if there is a religious component. So there's a little bit of a bad
and by
blood
this point
sort of
already, I feel like the Sunnis were probably outnumbering the Shias to a degree.
No, to this day, Shia Islam there is less followers of Shia. I believe. I'm not sure.
I just remember.
If you go into statistics, the numbers might be different.
I just remember
but at
from
that point,
census maps, there was like Iran's kind of the major stronghold.
By that point, we have to understand that for 800 years, Shia Islam and the followers of Shia Islam very much lived like the early Christian church. They lived mostly in the underground, and they also worshipped in the underground. And
they were forced there, probably.
Yes, and very rarely were they actually able to become part of public life. But in Iran, all of this kind of changed. It was the first time that Shia Islam was actually allowed to be practiced out in the open.
Yeah, and probably due to Iran. Iran has always been this middle ground, right, in the region, where the Silk Road routes go through, so it's a real melting pot of various different economic and religious groups. So if it was going to thrive anywhere, Shiism probably have been Persia.
One of the reasons why it was accepted, and as you said, it was,
Iran's not unusual for fostering sort of minority religions at all.
The problem that there was at that time is that Persians back then, because we have to differentiate between Persia and Iran. Iran is a more relative recent term. Persia is what it was called back then in the 16th century until very recently.
Yeah.
Persians, like Shias, have been persecuted, have been ruined by war, invaded by foreign influences. Back then it was the Ottoman Empire.
Before then it was the Mongols.
Exactly.
And Timurline and all these other dictators.
That's right.
That time.
And this type of commonality exists to this day. In fact, when you actually look at Shia Islam, you could almost think it's ultra-leftist. Because one of the reasons why
progressive.
Yes. Well, not progressive. We are still kind of like in the 16th century. So what has
progressive as it was different, more breaking away from the more established sort of thing, thinking it's going somewhere and improving. That's nonsense. Not in the modern sense.
In a sense, yes.
Not in the modern sense.
But what was going on in Persia at this time was they were pushing back against the caliphate, correct? And during that time, there was also kind of like a common struggle against the enemy. And Shia Islam is all about Hajj, which is fundamental right. And it meshes actually well with struggles like this. Later on, it becomes more of a class struggle. But back then, being that the caliphate was very authoritarian, it was a pushback against authority. The only problem that there was is that within a short amount of time, the dynasty, the monarchs, realized it was not just against the Ottomans, it was against all monarchies.
Well, yes.
Or authorities.
Yeah, anarchistic tendencies.
Yes.
Respect.
So,
any particular
once
authority.
all was said and done, it has already become part of Persian culture and the Persian people. It was embraced. Mosques to this very day are places, like when you go, for instance, to a Christian church, it's a place of reflection. It's kind of closed in. It's expected for you to be more quiet. Mosques are the total opposite. People go there. There's open courtyards. People congregate. There's sometimes even families meet. Business deals are being made.
It was a public space.
It's a public space, but also a space where you can talk about anything, where all people are united as equals. And that is a very important distinction also between, I would say, not only kind of like the public life versus, religious life, but also the difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. That kind of like embracing that all of us are struggling together, all of us are dealing with the same issues, and here's a place where we can all be equals. Now, on the one hand, this was a good balance, and that is the reason why that part that has then become part of the Persian culture was allowed to exist, because by then people have been really, there was a lot of conversion going on, there was a lot of acceptance going on, but it was also at the same time oppressed. So for the longest time, until the Islamic Revolution of the 60s and 70s, that type of belief that united Persians back then, and I'm saying Persians then to kind of like differentiate between what was going on then versus what started then with the Shahs, because that's a different chapter of monarchy and dynasty. That very much, to me, also explains why this conflict and why this is so kind of complicated and hard to unpack, is because there are so many different compounding factors here.
Oh yeah, there's layers of cultural antagonism, old blood feuds, territorial claims, economic routes up for dispute. Yeah, it's quite the tangle. And so also interesting to me that we can tie your mom's life so intimately with the current situations, in that her in her lifetime, especially while she was in Iran, she really...
So she was born in 1957,
Yeah.
just to give a concept.
Yeah, and in her lifetime, she definitely bore witness to the country in its most formative years.
It's
and
very
its most
fascinating.
active, because, yeah, after the revolution, yes, besides the Iraq-Iran war, the country really stagnated. So
Well, the
she
thing is,
really witnessed that birth
yeah,
of a new thing.
definitely. But what is so
And that draws
fascinating?
attention to how recent a lot of this is as well.
Yes, yes. What is very fascinating about her life, because it exemplifies how much and how quickly a country was changing, but at the same time, this was also a long time in the making.
Yeah.
Because as I explained, the Iranian or the Persian people themselves have always been kind of in the middle of various different authorities pulling them back and forth.
Yeah, their geographic location
Yes.
made them extremely suspect of that.
Yes. So there was foreign, also internal, based on the dynasties, the monarchies, religious leaders. But what I find interesting is, so my mom grows up in northern Iran with a very European outlook,
Mm-hmm.
and actually a rather European lifestyle. One has to understand, when you look at Iran now, especially when it comes to women and girls, yes, her parents were barely able to read and write, but she was able to go to school all the way until she graduated when she was 17. She was also one of 6 daughters. There was also one son.
Yeah, very big family.
Which was a really big family. And all 7 children, both parents insisted, needed to go to school and get an education.
Yeah, it was part of the general cultural feeling at the time.
Yes.
That these facilities are now available, and the government is, of course, encouraging everyone to go to school because they wanted to modernize.
And it's very interesting because this ability for her to go to school and wear miniskirts and makeup, and when she then graduated from school, she was also able to go to work. She was working for one of the big gas companies that were in Iran. She was a secretary there. One of the reasons why she was able to do this is because we then need to understand that at the turn of the last century, there was more and more of an influence again of foreign powers. And in this case, it was a mixture between Europe, and specifically Britain, and Russia. A lot of people think that the connection between Iran and Russia is a more recent thing, but that kind of connection goes back a long way.
Yeah, Russia has always been interested in what's going on beyond the Caspian Sea.
Yes. So there was an assassination attempt on one of the monarchs back then, and little known character back then. He was a soldier, a mere humble soldier, who also likewise, and we have to understand that at this time, majority of Iran was actually very poor.
It was a backwater.
It was very much
agricultural economy. Most people were just farmers.
There was just the beginnings
like
of resource, but we have to understand that oil and gas was not yet on the main stage when it comes to economy.
Yeah, no, I think this is worth focusing on. It's just a little bit of background to contextualize.
Yes, what was going on?
Current situation, right?
Exactly.
And I know just from older history that Iran especially has had a big manpower sort of crisis. Where, due to old Mongolian invasions and later on the Tamerlane regime in the late medieval period, just committing a lot of atrocities in the area, population levels in the Middle East and specifically Iran never really recovered from all of that, from all of this warfare, and then later plagues and so forth. So when they lacked a human capital to sort of form law centralized states, it did put them in a very vulnerable position, which of course the Ottomans took advantage of, and later the British. So they were invulnerated quite a bit. If you look at the old histories, you hear about the Achaemenid Empire, which of course ruled over the entire Middle East during the Greek classical times. And then after that, the Sassanids, they managed to hold on to a lot of territory against the Romans, and during the early Middle Ages, the entire Islamic world had a bit of a golden age in terms of how far the territory went, how much their economic grasp crept across the globe through their monopolies over the Silk Road. But then after that, after the so-called Islamic golden age of the first millennium, they never recovered. You can blame the Mongols to a large degree for that, because they seriously depopulated the entire region. But you can also probably point to internal issues, as is always the case with old civilizations. This split between Shia and Sunni, and also different philosophical debates that went on in Islam at the time. They compromise its ability to effectively stabilize and project itself. So when the British came across them, finally, the British being this very dynamic and aggressive sort of colonial.
Well, but before the British came, there was a lot of Russian influence as well.
Because the Russians had their empire, they were very expansionistic, then they went through the revolution, the Soviets were still basically imperialist.
So what has happened is there was kind of like an internal coup, because coups
but anyway, that's kind of like just the entire backdrop of Iran.
That is pretty much, coups and kind of like sudden changes like this is very much part and parcel of Iranian history, past into present. So what was going on at the end of the last century, there was a murder attempt against the monarch, and it was successful, and an individual was noticed by the Russians because the assassin was captured, taken to the city of Qom, which is a very important city. I mean, it's in the middle of the desert in Iran, but it has a lot of religious significance, especially in Shia Islam, to this very day. And his name was Nasruddin Shah, or he became the Shah. So his name is Nasruddin.
We should mention Shah just means king.
Yes.
In Persian.
So he was Nasruddin, and he was noticed, came to the attention of the foreign leaders, and as I mentioned before, like many of his compatriots in Iran, he was barely able to read and write, but he was the perfect, obedient little soldier. He had certain qualities that especially lent themselves to the foreign, I would say, influencers in Iran at that time. And they actually elected him to be the Shah, the next monarch, which, depending on who you ask, some people, especially the upper classes and the elite, and I'm saying this because one has to understand this was the beginning sort of the end when it comes to why we have the conflict that we have now. Because being that he was essentially put into place by foreign edict and influence,
which becomes that comes up again and again in modern Iranian
exactly
history.
Being that he was, his first thing really was to be completely anti-Persian, and that was the first time that Persia ceased to be, and it became Iran. He was also
getting
very
in
much
touch with that revolutionary spirit that seemed to infest the early
That's right.
20th century.
There was a huge push against not just Shia Islam or religion, but essentially all religion. It became very secular.
Yeah, that probably led to how, and I wanted to mention this earlier, how a lot of modern Iranians, they're not all 100% Shia. There's a huge percentage of other religions or just general secularism in the modern populace of the place. I remember some census data saying like up to a quarter of Iranians was identified as secular, and it's
but
it's
I think
modern.
If you would look at any country, that would be very much.
No, of course, but it's interesting to point out here because we were talking about them being a theocracy and a Shiite country.
Now that they are.
But even now, there's a lot of secularism, and you could probably just trace that to these shahs, these monarchs, dissuading this kind of. I mean, I guess you could say almost like in the case of Iran, sort of like a backcountry religion. It was a mostly rural population.
I think what is important to mention here, and we did this before, is that at that time, the Iranian/Persian people had a lot to struggle with.
Yeah.
Okay? And when this changeover of dynasty occurred, in this case, Nasruddin, he did not come from the elite or the upper class. He was basically just put into place because he was the obedient little follower there.
Yeah.
And also very good at adapting and being all pro-West and very pro-European.
Yeah, and thus began
that's right.
modern Iran's sort of love affair with the West.
He especially, and maybe that is also the core of the problem, is that he was so pampered and supported that yes, the upper classes and the elite were kind of like supporting him and part of all of this and benefited greatly because it was, pro-West equals capitalism equals riches.
Oil was discovered.
Like for instance, there's a little story going around because although my mother, to go back to my mother again, benefited greatly in her personal life from what was going on at this time, she would still, and this is an interesting little thing. It's a little, I would say, habit that a lot of Iranians have, and Iranians know what I'm talking about, which is they can suffer from an inferiority and superiority complex at the same time, which is fascinating to experience and watch. So my mom was very much aware of her working class background, but she also presented herself as, I don't want to say better. My mom was never one that put herself above others, but she was striving to be better. And that is whether through education or dressing herself a certain way, speaking a certain way. This is the reason why when she became, when she went to Austria, and she was then an immigrant in Austria, her first goal was to learn the language, to integrate, because she was kind of used to these kind of European Western ideals, but now she was able to live them, and she wanted to live up to those kind of ideas and ideals she had in her head.
And so I suppose we can link this complex of theirs, feeling superior and also having a bit of inferiority as well. Probably trace it fairly back.
Well, that is a direct result, though, because if you think about what we were talking,
have this where they have
not just country. I think Iran is very unique in this because I was already speaking about the fact that Shia Islam, one of its, I would say, more interesting aspects is that everybody's equal. There's a certain brotherhood. Like, one is not bad. Individual differences or what is truly going on, I'm not speaking about. I'm speaking about what the actual tenets is, what the belief system values and celebrates. So I'm not going to go into gender because that doesn't come into play, and it's really, I don't think that's part of the conversation. I will focus on more all people are equal, can participate equally, and it focuses on class. That's the reason why there's such a big emphasis on brotherhood, okay? But at the same time, both Shia and the people of Iran have suffered a lot, have been persecuted a lot. So there's kind of like this, we have struggled and we have survived, and we have still like this united front, but at the same time, we know we cannot compete, especially now, on the world stage.
Speaking of,
Yes.
we last left the first Persian, the first Iranian Shah that you mentioned.
Yeah.
This would have been during World War One.
It's actually, no, it's Nasruddin was, so he was at the beginning of the last century, so 1900s, and he was mostly outside of Iran. He loved to travel. He loved the Western life.
And at this point,
there's actually a story about him, which is a funny story.
Right.
He especially liked France. There's an interesting thing about Iran. Being that French, and I need to also mention my mother actually didn't go to a regular school. She went to a French lycée. And she was also fluent in French.
I recall the last Persian king was a Francophile.
Yes. And the reason why that is, to this day actually, there's a lot of street names or a lot of words that are almost French, or French sounding, especially when it comes to modern terms. And the reason why that is because it's easier for Persian people to say French words versus any other language. That's the reason why it was always so hard for my mom to learn German. German is a hard language to learn anyway. Der, die, das, which
Gendered,
means
yeah.
everything has a gender or kind of a connection to something. I don't know. I mean, there's so much more than that, but it was a very hard language for her to learn.
So he was traveling.
So he was traveling a lot, and he especially loved Paris, and he especially loved the Parisian brothels. And he owed so much money in the brothels that he actually sold off certain rights to France and at this point there was a lot of, if you think about, like the British Museum in Egypt, well, the same was going on in the Middle East. In this case, a lot of French would go to the Middle East and do archaeological digs, and he actually sold rights. The French could come anytime, any place, anywhere, do the digs, and anything they find, they can take with them back to France.
And there's a lot of history locked up in that land, for sure.
A lot. I haven't gone into, I haven't done any research if anything is still in France. I do remember that I was in a museum in the 90s that had a large Persian collection, and so did the Vienna Museum of History, I believe.
Guess there's probably still a fair amount. I know that, for example, Britain is giving back a lot of their artifacts that they took from Egypt, and there's a lot of countries that are doing that, but France...
I don't know...
Yeah, France seems to have... I guess, I don't know, they're just very prideful about...
That's right.
Everything they've done.
Yeah.
And so I could see them keep pulling on that stuff. I mean, worth looking at, perhaps, as a point of interest, but so
in a nutshell, this was now, because you were saying this was like the First World War.
Yeah.
So he was in power, or empowered, a de facto leader until World War One, and his heir was Reza Khan, who was the total opposite to Nasruddin. Nasruddin was a small, slight man. Reza Khan was tall and very formidable to his followers. He was a soldier through and through. Like his father, he was a soldier. And I remember growing up and my mom going, well, there were very famous Persian kings and dynasties. And as much as the Shah, enabled us to be free until the revolution, he was also illiterate swine, essentially. And that's what I was describing about this whole superiority inferiority complex. So on the one hand, these are the superior qualities because I was able to have this freer life, but at the same time, he was illiterate.
Well, I guess a country gets the king they need, not the one they ask for.
That's right. So his son, Reza Khan, came into power around the First World War. And this is important
So
because
big things are happening
also,
in the world.
yes, this was also the time when Russia came on the world stage,
Soviet
especially
Russia.
with Soviet Russia with communism.
Mm-hmm.
And again, one of the reasons why I mentioned how Shia Islam was about brotherhood and the class struggle.
You could say they found some fertile ground in there.
That's right. Iranian people, Shia Islam, Russian ideas and ideals found fertile ground. And for a while, Reza Khan was very much aligning himself with Russia. He became the commander and leader. He didn't only become the Shah, but he was also the commander and leader of the Persian Cossacks. But like his father, he did like luxury and, had some fond leanings towards capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And that is another interesting aspect if you know Iranians. They can be very humble, but they do like the luxuries.
There are also, I guess it pays mentioning, this could have a variable influence on how Persians have dealt with people, but Islam as a religion does elevate the merchant class
Yes,
more so than
that's a good point.
a lot of other cultures and religions.
The
For example,
self-made
even in Christianity,
person.
I mean, it's quite clear in the Bible that
pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of thing.
Yeah, that exists, but there's also a fair amount of contempt for people who deal with like money and goods a lot because there's the connection that can corrupt you. Whereas in Islam, because Muhammad, of course, was a merchant, there's this huge respect for the entrepreneurial merchant person. This is why they controlled the Silk Road. It wasn't just geographic.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just their geographic location.
Well, this is also...
They managed it. They were the middlemen.
Absolutely. And this was also part and parcel of Reza Khan's idea.
Yeah.
And about the future
going
of Iran.
into the 20th century, they still have that strong mercantile, I guess you could say opportunist.
Well,
sort of
here's
mindset.
the thing. Reza Khan, like his dad, was also not a learned man. He was a man of action. He was the perfect soldier. He was strong. He had very innate qualities and leadership qualities, and he had a lot of followers because he led by doing. Now, his goal was to build up Iran, not to the first and the second. That kind of went to European nations at that point, including actually, well, back then America was not on the kind of stage too much.
Isolationist.
Yeah, it was isolationist, but he aspired and inspired Iran to become the third best country when it comes to military. Yeah. But in order to build up the military, he knew he needed money. And Russia was not forthcoming with that. Russia was good for certain ideas because it gave him validity to be a leader, because it's kind of like the classless man who is capable of being a leader. But he knew he needed capital. It's that money thing again.
The harsh realities of leadership.
And at that point, there was changes, of course. Oil all of a sudden took center stage when it comes to a resource. And Iran happens to be a country where there's a lot of, or has been, a lot of oil and gas. And so certain European nations became interested in regards to this. And
they already had.
One of them was Britain.
Yeah, and it also pays mentioning that these interested parties already had significant holdings throughout the Middle East.
That's right.
Israel, or as it was back then Palestine, that was a British protectorate, as were many other territories around, and other countries, of course, laid claim to them.
That's right.
Iran, in this sense, was, I would say, a little unique in that it wasn't actually controlled by foreign powers. Because if you look in the other direction as well, towards India, that was all under the Raj. at the time, the British Raj. So it was kind of the odd one out in that regard.
Yeah.
I guess you could say it had the luxury of being able to choose its own destiny to a degree, because it didn't have to answer to London or Berlin or any of these other European authorities.
Well, in this case, Iran sort of had to start doing that.
Yeah, they had to play
with
diplomat.
especially with Reza Khan.
Yeah.
But at the same time, just like he did with Russia, and being that Reza Khan was so enarmored with military might, we know what happened, starting in the 20s, going through the 30s.
Interwar period, yeah. By this point, the Ottomans were gone.
That was not a threat anymore, of course.
So there's a power vacuum as well starting to form here, because the Ottomans,
definitely,
as dysfunctional as they were as a state towards their later years during World War One, they were still maintaining something. And I do remember the Germans, especially during World War One, were interested in revitalizing the Ottomans by getting railroads.
It's funny that you're mentioning the Germans, because the Germans come into play in the late 20s, early 30s, because as I mentioned, Reza Khan was a military man, and he saw one power specifically building up its military power and might, which was the Third Reich.
Right.
Now, one thing, it's like a little historical fact that historians might know about, but many people might not. Especially during World War II, one of the reasons why Reza Khan was essentially forced by the Allied forces to abdicate his throne to the main character of the Shah dynasty, which is his son, which is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is because during World War II, there was supplies being shipped through Iran.
Oh, yes.
And also Iran had dealings with the Third Reich when it